Katherine Morrow had always been drawn to places where the veil between history and myth grew thin. There was something intoxicating about the old stories, the ancient whispers of curses, and the decaying remnants of the past. When she first read about the small village of Ravenshollow, tucked away in a forgotten valley far from modern roads, she had felt an inexplicable pull. She had to go there to unravel the mysteries buried within the rotting walls of Hawthorn House. The village greeted her with a chill in the air, though the autumn sun was still high when she arrived. The trees that lined the narrow path leading into Ravenshollow were gnarled and twisted, their leaves the color of rust, as if stained by something darker than the changing season. The wind that passed through them carried a low, mournful howl, and she couldn't help but shiver as she crossed the threshold into the village. The people she encountered were silent and wary, their eyes filled with suspicion as they watched her from behind closed doors and shuttered windows. The village square was nothing more than a small clearing bordered by an old church, a crumbling inn, and a handful of cottages that looked as though they had seen better centuries. No one lingered outside, and the silence was oppressive. It was as though the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for something Katherine couldn't quite name. She approached the inn, where an old man stood behind the counter, his face lined with deep wrinkles that spoke of a life lived in the shadow of fear. When Katherine mentioned her intention to stay at Hawthorn House, she noticed a visible tremor run through him. "You don't want to go up there, miss," he warned in a voice so low she had to strain to hear him. "That place is cursed. The dark moon is rising soon, and when it does, things happen. Strange things." Katherine, ever the skeptic, offered him a polite smile. "I appreciate the concern, but I've traveled a long way to study the house. I'm not one to let superstition get in the way of my work." The old man shook his head, his eyes wide with something that might have been fear, or perhaps pity. "It's not superstition, miss. It's history. The Hawthorns. They were good folk once before the Dark Moon. But something happened in that house, something evil. If you value your life, you'll leave before night falls." Katherine nodded, though she didn't believe him. She had heard similar stories in countless towns before, each claiming its own curse or haunted relic. None of them had ever held any truth. Still, the way the old man's hands shook as he handed her the key to her room left a knot of unease in her stomach. She gathered her things quickly, not wanting to linger in the unsettling stillness of the village any longer than necessary. As she made her way up the narrow, winding road that led to Hawthorn House, she found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once, though there was nothing but the shadows of the trees following her. Hawthorn House stood at the top of a hill, an imposing structure that had once been grand but now seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. Its tall, pointed gables rose against the sky like the broken bones of some ancient beast, and its windows were dark, staring down at her like empty eyes. The roof was missing several shingles, and the walls were streaked with black mold that spread like veins across the decaying wood. Yet, despite its state of ruin, there was a strange allure to the house, something that drew Katherine closer like a moth to flame. She stepped through the iron gate, its hinges creaking in protest, and walked up the overgrown path toward the front door. The air grew colder the closer she got, and by the time she reached the threshold, she could see her breath misting in front of her. She paused for a moment, the old man's warning echoing in her mind, but she pushed it aside. This was just another abandoned house, one of many she had visited in her research. Inside, the house smelled of dust and rot. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she made her way through the grand foyer, where faded wallpaper peeled from the walls in long, curling strips. The furniture was covered in dust and cobwebs, the remnants of a once elegant home now reduced to little more than a tomb. But it was the silence that unnerved her most. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the feeling that the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to stir. She spent the next few hours exploring the house, her lantern casting long shadows on the walls as she made her way through the labyrinth of rooms. There was an unsettling sense of familiarity about the place, as though she had been there before, though she knew that was impossible. The house had been abandoned for decades, ever since the last of the Hawthorns vanished during the Dark Moon a century ago. The journals she had found in the town's archives told the story of Victor Hawthorn, the last patriarch of the family, who had become obsessed with a ritual to summon ancient beings from beyond the veil of the living. According to legend, he had sacrificed his family to these beings in exchange for eternal life, but something had gone terribly wrong. The townspeople claimed that the Hawthorns had been cursed, their souls trapped in the house, waiting for the Dark Moon to return so they could finish what Victor had started. Katherine didn't believe in curses, but as the sun began to set and the shadows inside the house grew darker, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The air grew heavier, pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She had intended to stay the night, to document her findings, but now a creeping sense of dread gnawed at the edges of her mind. Just as she was about to leave the house, she heard something, a faint rustling sound like fabric brushing against the floorboards. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a low whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Katherine." Her heart slammed against her ribs and she spun around, holding up her lantern to pierce the darkness. But there was nothing there, just the empty hallway stretching out before her, the shadows flickering like ghosts in the dim light. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. It was just her imagination, she told herself. The house was old, full of drafts and creaking wood. But even as she tried to reason it away, the whisper came again, louder this time, echoing through the halls. "Katherine." She backed away, her pulse racing. She needed to leave. Now she turned and hurried toward the front door, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. But when she reached the entrance, the door wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, panic rising in her chest, but it was as if the house itself was holding her captive. "Katherine." The whisper was right behind her now, chilling her to the bone. She spun around again, her back pressed against the door, and her lantern flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. And then, the lantern went out. Darkness swallowed her whole. The Dark Moon had arrived. Katherine awoke to the sound of whispers. At first, they were faint, barely distinguishable from the creaking of the house and the rustling of the wind through the broken windows. But as she slowly regained her senses, the whispers grew louder, clearer, like voices carried on the edge of a distant breeze. They were speaking her name, their words cold and serpentine, slithering into her mind and wrapping around her thoughts like tendrils of darkness. She opened her eyes and found herself lying on the cold, damp floor of the Hawthorn House's basement. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and the stone walls around her seemed to pulse with an unnatural, rhythmic vibration, as though something deep within the house was alive and breathing. Her head throbbed and her vision swam as she tried to make sense of where she was. How had she gotten down here? The last thing she remembered was the front door slamming shut, trapping her inside the house. The whispers had followed her, echoing through the halls, growing louder with each step she took. Then the lantern had gone out, plunging her into darkness. She must have fallen, but no, something more had happened. She could feel it like a shadow hanging over her, a presence that lingered just out of sight. The whispers were real, and they wanted her. Katherine slowly sat up, her body aching as though she had been dragged across the floor. Her hands were covered in dust and grime, and her clothes clung to her skin, damp with the cold sweat of fear. She reached for her lantern, but it was gone, lost somewhere in the dark. She squinted into the blackness around her, trying to find some point of reference, some clue as to where she was. And then she saw them, faint outlines in the shadows, figures standing just beyond the reach of the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the ceiling. They were tall and thin, with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. Their forms were indistinct, flickering in and out of existence, as though they were made of the shadows themselves. Katherine's breath caught in her throat. She tried to move, but her legs felt as though they were filled with lead, heavy and uncooperative. The figures drew closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. She could feel their presence pressing in on her from all sides, a cold, suffocating sensation that made her heart race. "Who are you?" she managed to choke out, her voice hoarse and trembling. The whispers paused for a moment as if considering her question, before resuming with renewed fervor. This time the words were clearer, though still difficult to comprehend. They spoke in a language that felt ancient, older than any she had ever encountered in her studies, but the meaning came through nonetheless. "We are the forgotten, the watchers of the dark, the ancients." Katherine's heart pounded in her chest. She had read about them in Victor Hawthorn's journals, the ancients, beings that predated humanity, creatures that had once ruled over this land in secret, feeding on the life force of those who dared to wander too close to their domain. They were not vampires in the traditional sense. They were something far more sinister. Beings of shadow and bone, sustained not by blood alone, but by the essence of life itself, drawn to the living, like moths to flame. Victor had made a pact with them, believing he could control their power, use it to extend his own life and that of his family. But instead, the ancients had turned on him, twisting his mind and consuming his soul. The last entries in his journal were incoherent scribbles, fragments of a broken mind lost to the whispers of the ancients. Katherine's skin prickled with fear. She could feel the weight of their gaze upon her, though they had no eyes that she could see, only the glowing embers that seemed to peer into the deepest corners of her soul. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of terror and defiance. The whispers coiled around her like a noose tightening around her throat. "You belong to us. You will serve, like those before you. Complete the circle and open the gate and be free." Katherine shook her head, trying to clear the fog of fear that clouded her thoughts. "I won't. I'm not like Victor. I won't do your bidding." A low, rumbling sound echoed through the basement, something between a laugh and a growl. The shadows seemed to ripple and shift, the figures swaying as though caught in some unseen current. You will, Katherine. You cannot resist the pull. The Dark Moon calls to you. The gateway is already opening, and soon we will return to claim what is ours." The ground beneath her began to tremble, and the walls seemed to close in, the vibrations growing stronger, more violent. Catherine's pulse quickened as she realized what was happening. The house, the very land itself, was reacting to the presence of the ancients. The barrier between their world and hers was weakening, and soon they would be free to cross over, to feed on the life force of every soul in Ravenshollow. She couldn't let that happen. She had to find a way to stop them. With a surge of adrenaline, Katherine pushed herself to her feet and stumbled toward the far wall, where she had noticed a faint glow, something etched into the stone, barely visible through the layers of dust and grime. She wiped it away with trembling hands and revealed an ancient symbol carved deep into the stone. It was the same sigil she had seen in the old church, a mark of protection, something that could hold the ancients at bay. She pressed her hand against the symbol, hoping it would do something, anything, to push back the darkness. For a moment, nothing happened. The whispers grew louder, the shadows pressed closer, and Katherine felt herself beginning to fade, her strength draining away. But then a pulse of energy surged through her, emanating from the symbol. The whispers faltered, the figures recoiling as if struck by an invisible force. The pressure in the room lessened, and Katherine gasped for breath, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. The ancients were not gone, but they were weakened, forced back into the shadows for the time being. She had bought herself a few precious moments, but she knew it wouldn't last. The dark moon was rising, and the gateway between worlds was opening. The ritual Victor had started, the one he had failed to complete, was still in motion, and now it was up to her to stop it before the ancients broke free entirely. She had to finish what Victor had started, but not in the way the ancients intended. She had to find the source of their power, the heart of the ritual, and destroy it before it was too late. But where was it? And how could she possibly stand against beings so ancient, so powerful? The ground trembled again, and Katherine knew she didn't have much time. She had to move quickly, or everything would be lost. Ravenshollow, her own life, and perhaps even her very soul. Steeling herself, she turned away from the glowing sigil and began to make her way deeper into the house, guided by some unseen force, a dark instinct that she both feared and relied upon. She would find the heart of the ritual. She would face the ancients, and somehow she would end this nightmare before they consumed her completely. The whispers followed her, growing fainter as she descended further into the depths of the house, but they never truly left her mind. They were always there, lurking at the edges of her thoughts, waiting for her to slip, to falter, to give in to the darkness. But Katherine was determined. She had come too far to fail now. The return of the ancients had begun, but so had her fight to stop them. And the dark moon continued to rise, casting its blood-red glow over Ravenshollow, heralding the horror yet to come. Katherine had always prided herself on her ability to keep a calm head in the face of fear. But as she stood in the heart of Hawthorn House, staring into the yawning abyss that had opened beneath the old mansion, that calm was shattered. The basement floor had crumbled away to reveal a cavernous pit, its walls lined with ancient symbols that pulsed with a sickly red glow. Shadows twisted and writhed at the edges of the pit, slithering along the stone like living things. It was as though the earth itself had opened up to reveal something primordial and evil, a gateway to a world beyond human comprehension. The air in the cavern was cold and stifling, filled with the stench of rot and old blood. Katherine could hear the low, guttural whispers rising from the depths, echoing up from the dark void like the chanting of some long-forgotten cult. They called to her, tugging at her mind, trying to pull her into the darkness below. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee this cursed place and never look back. But she knew it was too late for that. The ancients were awake, and the nightmare had only just begun. The dark moon hung high in the sky above Ravenshollow, casting its crimson light through the shattered windows of the mansion. Outside, the village was deathly still, as if the world itself was holding its breath in the face of the horrors that had been unleashed. The villagers were hiding, praying behind locked doors that they might be spared from the wrath of the ancients. But Katherine knew that no one was safe, not from what was coming. As she stood on the edge of the pit, her heart racing and her breath shallow, she heard a sound behind her, a soft rustling like the movement of fabric in the wind. She spun around, her eyes wide, and saw them. The ancients. They emerged from the shadows of the basement, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkness itself. Tall and gaunt, their bodies seemed to shift and ripple as they moved, as though they were not entirely physical. Their skin was pale and translucent, stretched tight over sharp bones, and their eyes glowed with a malevolent crimson light that pierced the gloom. Their faces were human yet wrong, twisted into expressions of hunger and cruelty, their mouths filled with sharp, blood-stained teeth. Katherine's stomach churned with revulsion, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from them. There was something mesmerizing about their movements, something almost beautiful in their grace, despite the horror they embodied. The ancients were not like anything she had ever encountered in her studies. These were no mere vampires, no creatures of folklore. They were older, darker, and far more dangerous than anything she could have imagined. One of them stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Its eyes fixed on her, burning with a hunger that went beyond mere flesh and blood. Katherine could feel it, deep inside her, as though the creature was reaching into her very soul, pulling at the essence of her life. "Why do you resist, Katherine?" it whispered, its voice low and rasping, like the scrape of bone against stone. "You cannot fight what you do not understand. You belong to us now. Accept it, and you will know true power. Resist, and you will suffer." Katherine backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the cold tendrils of fear curling around her, tightening their grip on her mind. The weight of the darkness pressed down on her, suffocating, crushing her will to fight, but she couldn't give in. She wouldn't. "You won't take me," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'll stop you. I'll close the gate." The creature's twisted smile widened, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Foolish child, the gate has already opened. You are too late." Katherine's pulse quickened. She glanced over her shoulder, down into the pit, where the red light pulsed like the heartbeat of some great, slumbering beast. She could feel it now. The gateway between worlds had been torn open, and the ancients were pouring through, their numbers growing with every passing moment. But she couldn't give up. She had to find a way to stop them, to close the gate before they could break free entirely. Her mind raced, trying to piece together everything she had learned from Victor Hawthorn's journals, from the stories the villagers had told, the sigils she had found in the old church. They had repelled the ancients, driven them back. But that had been a temporary measure. She needed something stronger, something that would sever their connection to this world once and for all. As if in response to her thoughts, the creature lunged at her, its clawed hands reaching for her throat. Katherine barely had time to react. She stumbled backward, her feet slipping on the loose stones at the edge of the pit. Her heart lurched as she teetered on the brink, her arms flailing wildly for balance. The creature's claws grazed her arm, slicing through her jacket and drawing blood. With a cry of pain, Katherine pushed herself away from the pit, narrowly avoiding the creature's grasp. Her back slammed into the stone wall, knocking the breath from her lungs. She gasped for air, her vision swimming as she fought to stay conscious. The creature circled her, its crimson eyes gleaming with anticipation. "You cannot escape, Katherine. The darkness is already inside you. It calls to you, just as it did to Victor. You will join us, or you will die." Katherine's mind raced. She could feel the darkness creeping closer, closing in on her from all sides. But she couldn't let it win. She had to find a way to fight back. Her eyes darted around the basement, searching for anything she could use, anything that might help her stop the ancients. And then she saw it. At the far end of the basement, partially hidden by debris and fallen beams, was an old altar. It was carved from dark stone, covered in dust and cobwebs, but there was something about it that called to her. Katherine didn't know how she knew, but she felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if the altar was the key to everything. With a surge of determination, she pushed herself to her feet and darted toward the altar. The creature hissed and lunged after her, but she was faster. Her heart pounded in her ears as she reached the altar and knelt before it, brushing away the dust and grime to reveal the ancient symbols carved into its surface. They were the same symbols she had seen in the church, the same sigils of protection. But there was more. Beneath the layers of dirt, she uncovered a hidden compartment, its edges worn and cracked with age. Her hands trembled as she pried it open, revealing a small, blackened book bound in leather. Its pages were brittle and yellowed with age, but the symbols inscribed within glowed faintly with an otherworldly light. Katherine's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was what Victor had been searching for, the key to controlling the ancients. But now in her hands it was no longer a tool of power. It was the means to destroy them. The creature hissed behind her, its breath hot and fetid on the back of her neck. "You cannot use that," it snarled. "It will destroy you." Katherine ignored the warning. Her fingers moved quickly, tracing the symbols in the book, reciting the incantations that had been buried in her mind ever since she had first set foot in Hawthorn House. She could feel the energy building around her, the air crackling with power. The ground beneath her trembled, and the shadows writhed in agony. The creature screamed, its form twisting and contorting as the power of the ritual took hold. Katherine could feel the weight of the darkness lifting, the pull of the ancients weakening. But it wasn't over yet. The gate was still open, the red light pulsing like a heartbeat deep within the pit. With a final desperate cry, Katherine slammed her hand down on the altar, completing the ritual. The book glowed brightly, and a wave of energy surged through the basement, filling the air with a deafening roar. The walls trembled, the floor cracked, and the ground beneath the pit began to collapse. The creatures shrieked in unison, their forms dissolving into shadow as the gate began to close. The red light flickered and faded, and the whispers that had plagued Katherine for so long were silenced. It was over. Katherine fell to her knees, her body shaking with exhaustion. The darkness was gone. the gate sealed. But the toll it had taken on her was immense. She could feel the remnants of the ancients still lingering in her mind, their presence like a faint echo that would never fully fade. She had stopped the horror for now, but she knew that the ancients were not truly gone. They were merely waiting, biding their time, trapped between worlds until the dark moon rose again. And when it did, Katherine knew they would return, more powerful than ever. But for now, there was silence. And in that silence, Katherine allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that the true battle was only just beginning. Katherine stood alone in the ruins of Hawthorn House, her body aching from the strain of battle, her mind reeling from the horrors she had witnessed. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the distant howls of the ancients still echoed in her ears like the fading memory of a nightmare. Outside, the dark moon hung low in the sky, its once fiery crimson light now dim and fading into a dull, ominous red. It was over, but not in the way she had hoped. The gateway had closed, the pit sealed, but the price of her victory weighed heavily on her. The cost had been more than just blood and sweat. It had been a piece of herself. She could still feel the touch of the ancients lingering inside her, a dark residue that refused to be washed away. Though they were gone, though their whispers had finally fallen silent, Katherine knew that they had left their mark on her, a stain on her soul that would never fade. The village of Ravenshollow was quiet, eerily so. No birds sang, no wind stirred the trees. The world held its breath, waiting for the dawn that had yet to come. Katherine stumbled out of the house, her legs weak beneath her, the weight of the night dragging her down. She paused at the entrance of the old church, its doors still open, still radiating that faint protective energy that had saved her once before. She wanted to collapse within its walls, to let the ancient sigils shield her from the world, to hide from everything that had happened. But she couldn't. Not yet. She needed to see it through. She needed to know that the village, the people, were safe. Katherine made her way slowly down the path toward the village square, her boots crunching over dead leaves and broken branches. The mist had returned, swirling around her legs as though trying to pull her back into the depths of the past. The shadows that had once haunted her every step were gone, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something still watched her from the darkened woods. Something patient, something waiting. When she reached the square, she found the villagers emerging from their homes, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. They had heard the sounds of the battle, the thunderous roar of the earth splitting open, and the cries of the ancients. They had felt the tremors beneath their feet, the very land trembling as the darkness was sealed away. But they hadn't known what it meant. They didn't know if the horror had truly ended or if the worst was still to come. Katherine could see the hope and fear mingling in their eyes as they looked at her, waiting for her to speak, waiting for her to tell them what had happened. She opened her mouth, but no words came. What could she say? How could she explain the things she had seen, the things she had done? How could she tell them that even though the ancients had been driven back, their presence still lingered, like a ghost that refused to leave? In the end, all she could do was offer them a weary nod. "It's over," she said, her voice rough with fatigue. "The gateway is closed. The ancients are gone." A collective sigh of relief passed through the crowd, but it was thin, hesitant. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, their relief tempered by the knowledge that this night, this cursed night, would not be the last. The dark moon would rise again, perhaps not for another century, but it would come, and with it, the horror would return. The cycle would begin anew. As Katherine stood there, surrounded by the wary, fearful eyes of the villagers, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over her. She had fought so hard, risked everything to stop the ancients, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her victory was only temporary. The darkness had been pushed back, but it wasn't gone. It was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to return. The villagers began to disperse, retreating to the safety of their homes, their doors locking with a finality that echoed through the empty square. Soon, Katherine was alone again, standing in the center of the village as the mist swirled around her feet. The silence pressed in on her from all sides, and for a moment she felt as though she were standing at the edge of a precipice, staring into the abyss of what was yet to come. She looked up at the dark moon, now nearly obscured by the mist and clouds, its light fading into nothingness. She had spent so long chasing answers, digging into the past to uncover the truth. And now that she had found it, she wasn't sure what to do with it. The ancients had left their mark on her, an indelible stain that would never wash away. She could feel them inside her still, their whispers reduced to faint echoes, but still present. They had not fully relinquished their grip on her, and perhaps they never would. As dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting the first pale light of morning across the village, Katherine turned her back on the square and began walking toward the road that led out of Ravenshollow. Her steps were slow, measured, each one heavier than the last. She felt hollow, emptied by the night's events, her body and soul worn down to nothing. But she couldn't stay here. Not now. Not after everything she had seen. The dark moon had passed, but its shadow lingered in her heart, a darkness that would follow her wherever she went. The road stretched out before her, winding through the dense forest, disappearing into the mist. She didn't know where it led, but she didn't care. She just needed to keep moving, to put as much distance between herself and Ravenshollow as possible. But even as she walked, Katherine couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart skipping a beat, but there was no one there, just the empty road and the mist swirling like ghostly tendrils in the pale light of dawn. And yet, she felt it. That presence, that lingering darkness. It was still with her, like a shadow she couldn't escape. The ancients had taken something from her, something she could never get back. And though the gateway was closed, she knew, deep down, that it was not the end. It was only the beginning of something far darker, far more insidious. The ancients had tasted her soul, and they would not let her go so easily. As she continued walking, the weight of the night's events pressing down on her shoulders, she felt a cold shiver run through her. The road ahead was long, and the darkness behind her was deeper than she had ever imagined. The final night had passed, but the terror it had unleashed was far from over. Katherine walked on, into the mist, knowing that no matter how far she went, the darkness would always be with her. It was a part of her now, and as the wind whispered through the trees, she heard the faintest echo of the ancient's voice in her mind, a promise that sent a chill down her spine. We will return. The dark moon may have set, but its shadow would haunt her nightmares forever. And as Katherine disappeared into the mist, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever truly be free, or if the darkness had already claimed her as its own.